The train left him standing alone on a platform that seemed to shimmer with heat, even though the afternoon was drawing thin toward evening, and he stood there a long moment before he moved, the way a man will stand at the edge of cold water before deciding whether he has the courage to wade in. His coat was gray with the dust of 3 territories. His boots had worn through at the left heel somewhere around the Nebraska line, and he had felt every stone of the roadbed since. He carried nothing but a canvas satchel with 2 shirts, a razor gone dull, and a small ledger book whose pages he had filled with careful, cramped figures, because it was the only thing left of a life that had once made sense to him. His hands, when he flexed them, pulled tight across old scars, the skin shining pink and hairless in ridges that told a story he no longer tried to explain to strangers. He walked the length of the boardwalk with the particular slowness of a man conserving strength he was not sure he had, and Larkspur Crossing revealed itself to him plank by plank, a mercantile with its shelves half empty from the summer's freight troubles, a saddler's shop smelling of neatsfoot oil, a boarding house with a hand-lettered sign in the window that read, "No vacancy," though the curtains behind it did not stir with any particular occupation. He knocked anyway, because a man learns to knock even when the answer is written plain before him, and the woman who opened the door looked at his boots first, then his hands, then would not look at his face at all. "We're full," she said, and shut it before he could tell her he only wanted a corner of floor, not a room. At the mercantile, the clerk would not extend him so much as a nickel's credit for a heel of bread, sliding the ledger back across the counter with 2 fingers, as though Elias's touch might soil the pages. "Not without money," the man said, not unkindly, "only tired. The way men in small towns grow tired of strangers passing through with empty pockets and complicated pasts trailing behind them like smoke." And it was smoke he thought of then, unbidden, the smell of it rising up through memory, the way it had risen through the rafters of a livery 2 years gone and 400 miles east, the horses screaming in a way he still heard some nights, the heat closing over him like a hand pressed to the mouth, and a lantern rocking on its hook before it fell, though whose hand had set it swinging he had never been able to prove to anyone's satisfaction but his own. He shook the memory loose the way he had learned to, and stood again in the ordinary dust of the ordinary street, hungry, and asked the air, mostly, since there was no one left to ask, whether any soul in this town meant to feed a man for honest work. The question hung there unanswered for a long moment, swallowed up by the general noise of the street, a dog barking somewhere behind the feed store, a hammer's dull ring from the smithy 2 doors down, the creak of a wagon easing over a rut, until a woman's voice answered it plainly, without ceremony, from just behind his shoulder. "I don't feed men for asking," she said, "but I'll feed a man who works." He turned and found her standing with a basket of onions balanced against her hip, her dress plain and sun-faded at the shoulders, her eyes taking his measure the way a buyer takes the measure of a horse, not unkindly, but without illusion either, cataloguing the state of his boots, the calluses ridged hard across his palms, the old burn scars that climbed his forearms like pale rivers where the sleeves had been rolled back against the heat of the day. She did not flinch from the scars the way the boarding-house woman had, nor did her gaze linger there with pity, which he noted and was grateful for before he had even decided whether to trust her. "I've a freight yard at the edge of town," she said. "2 axles broken clean through, a forge gone half to ruin, and a team so lamed I daren't hitch them to a full load. I need a man who knows iron and knows horses, and I haven't the coin to pay for promises." "I know iron," he said, and something in his voice must have carried more certainty than his circumstances warranted, because she studied him a moment longer before she answered. "Words are cheap on this street," she said. "I've heard finer ones from worse men." But I've a cot in the harness room going empty, and I'll set a plate for you tonight if you're willing to earn it before morning. Prove useful, and we'll talk wages after. Prove otherwise, and you'll have had one supper and a night's rest for your trouble, which is more than this town's offered you so far, by the look of you." It was not charity, and she made certain he understood that before he could mistake it for such. The way she held his eye rather than softening her offer with sympathy, the way she named the broken axles and the lamed team plainly as debts owed rather than misfortunes to be pitied. He thought of the ledger he still carried folded in his coat, the one that recorded every honest transaction of his life since Cedar Hollow, as if the keeping of it might one day answer a question no one had yet thought to ask him. And he thought, too, of the hunger sitting low and patient in his belly, and of how long it had been since anyone had offered him work instead of suspicion. "I'll come," he said, and something in the plain certainty of her nod told him she had expected nothing less. The memory came to him unbidden, as it often did in the quiet after a stranger's kindness, the way a bruise makes itself known only when pressed, and he let it come now because there was no fighting it, not with the smell of wood smoke still faint on the evening air from some distant chimney, close enough to the smell that had haunted him for 2 years to pull him backward through time as surely as a hand at his collar. He had been trusted then, in that other town, trusted the way a man is trusted who has shod every horse and mended every wheel rim for a decade without complaint, trusted the way the sound of his hammer against the anvil had become as familiar to the town as the church bell, marking the hours of honest labor. He had been asleep in the room above his shop when the shouting woke him, and he had known before he was fully dressed what the color of the light through his window meant, that particular orange that no lamp ever made, and he had run toward it rather than away, because the livery stood only 2 streets from his forge, and he had shod every one of those horses himself, knew their names, knew which ones spooked at smoke, and which merely stamped and complained. He remembered the heat of the door before he touched it, the way it had already begun to breathe fire through its cracks, and he remembered going in anyway, low, the way his father had taught him long ago, in a different fire, in a different life. Remembered the terror of the animals and the burn of his own palms as he'd worked the stall latches free one by one. Remembered leading them out coughing and half-blind into a crowd that had gathered to watch the building die. He had not seen in that chaos the man who stood near the loft ladder with a lantern swinging loose from his hand, had not seen it catch the straw, had not understood until much later, when the accusations had already hardened into certainty, that the very man now pointing at his scorched hands and his soot-blackened face had been the one who let the flame fall. It had been easier, he supposed, for a frightened town to believe the blacksmith had gone mad or careless than to believe one of their own neighbors had been careless with a lantern near dry hay. Easier to fix blame on the man dragging horses from the smoke than on the one who had lit the match to begin with. He had said nothing in his own defense that night, too stunned by the injustice of it, too raw with burns and grief, and by morning the town had already decided what kind of man he was, long before he understood that decisions made in fear are rarely undone by reason alone, and long before he learned that the only answer to such accusations was patient, quiet proof, kept and carried, waiting for a day when someone might finally ask to see it. The morning came up pale and cold over the yard, the kind of light that made everything look older than it was, the collapsed forge with its chimney leaning like a man too tired to stand straight, the 2 wagons canted on their broken axles as though kneeling in surrender, the lame horse standing apart from the others with its weight shifted off one foreleg, ears pinned back against whatever pain it carried. He walked the perimeter of it all before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, his breath fogging in the air, his boots crunching over frost-stiffened mud, and he did not hurry, because a man who hurried through an inspection missed the very things an inspection was meant to reveal. He knelt first at the forge, running his scarred fingers along the collapsed brickwork, testing the give of the mortar, and found it soft and crumbled where water had gotten in over some forgotten season and never properly dried. He moved next to the axles, crouching low in the dirt to sight down their length, the way a rifleman might sight a barrel, and saw the telltale bow in the iron that no amount of grease or patience would ever straighten on its own. He came last to the lame horse, and spoke to it low, the way he had once spoken to frightened animals in a burning barn, and the horse let him lift its hoof without flinching, though it held it back stiff and reluctant, favoring a swelling near the frog that told him plainly enough what had gone wrong and what it would take to put it right. The hired men had gathered by then near the bunkhouse door, not working, only watching, their arms crossed against the cold or against something less easily named, and none of them called out a greeting, though the youngest of them shifted his weight from foot to foot, as though he might have spoken if the other two had not been standing so near. He did not wait to be told twice, nor did he wait to be told at all. He found a shovel leaning against the barn wall and began clearing the broken brick from around the forge's base, stacking what could be salvaged and setting aside what could not, the rhythm of the work settling into his shoulders like an old hymn half remembered. He did not look up to see whether they were watching, though he could feel the weight of their attention the way a man feels weather changing before it arrives, and he understood without needing it explained to him that whatever trust he hoped to earn here would not come from words, but from the plain evidence of his hands moving through the cold morning air, one brick and one broken thing at a time, until the yard itself began, however slowly, to answer for him. 2 years before that morning, and some 100 miles east as the crow measured such distances, though it felt farther still to a man walking them on foot, he had left the town that had raised him and ruined him inside the space of a single burning night, carrying nothing that had not fit inside a canvas satchel gone gray with ash and travel. The good tools had gone first, sold not because he wished it, but because hunger did not negotiate, and he had stood in doorway after doorway in towns whose names he no longer troubled himself to remember, watching pawnbrokers turn his hammers and tongs over in their hands, as though weighing not the iron but the man who had made it, and always they gave him less than the metal was worth, and always he took it, because a coin in the pocket was worth more than pride left ringing in an empty forge. He had kept only one thing that could not be pawned, because no one would have wanted it, and because he would not have sold it if they had, and that was a small ledger bound in scuffed leather, its pages gone soft at the corners from handling, in which he recorded every purchase he made, however small, a nail, a length of rope, a sack of meal, the date and the price, and the name of whoever had sold it to him, written in a hand that had been taught to him by the man who trained him in the trade, before the fire, before the disgrace, before the word thief had attached itself to his name like a burr caught in wool, that would not be brushed free no matter how hard a man worked at it. His old master had been a careful man, suspicious by long habit of how easily a working man's reputation could be taken from him by someone with a louder voice or a longer purse, and he had told him once, standing over the anvil with sweat darkening his shirt, that a smith's word was worth exactly as much as the paper that could prove it, no more, no less, and that a man who did not keep account of what passed through his hands was a man waiting to be accused of something he never did. He had not understood it then, young as he was, and certain that honest work spoke plainly enough for itself, but he had understood it since, in the long months of walking and asking and being turned away, when the only thing he owned that could answer for him, without raising its voice, was a column of figures written in his own hand, proof against a world that had already decided, before he opened his mouth, exactly what kind of man he must be. The forge had been a ruin when he first walked around it, a collapsed heap of scorched stone and fallen mortar crouched behind the wagon shed, like something the yard had given up on along with everything else. And he had stood before it that first morning, with his hat in his hand, and studied it the way another man might study a grave, trying to see past what it had become to what it once must have been. He did not ask permission to rebuild it. He simply began, pulling the broken stones free one by one, and setting them in the sun to dry, sorting the good from the crumbling. And by the second day he had cleared enough of the old hearth to see the bones of it still sound beneath the wreckage, waiting only for a hand willing to put it back together. She came out with a bucket in the mornings before the heat rose too high to bear, and she did not speak much at first, only set the water where he could reach it, and stood a moment in the shade of the shed roof, watching the way his hands moved over the stone as though they had done this 1,000 times before and knew exactly what each motion cost and what it earned. There was a economy to it that she had not expected from a man who arrived with nothing, no wasted reaching, no second-guessing, only the steady patience of someone who understood that a forge built in haste was a forge that would fail a man precisely when he needed it least. By the fourth day the walls stood true again, squared and packed with new mortar he had mixed himself, from lime he'd bartered for with an afternoon's labor at the mercantile's loading dock, and on the fifth morning he laid the kindling and struck the flint and coaxed the first flame up through the tinder with a patience that made her forget, for a moment, to bring the water at all. "That's the first fire this yard has seen since my husband died," she said, and there was nothing mournful in the way she said it, only a kind of plain astonishment, as though she were reporting a fact about weather or harvest. "It won't be the last," he answered, not looking up from the flame, feeding it slow with kindling until it caught and held and began to breathe on its own, orange and low and steady. She stood longer that morning than she had any of the others, watching smoke rise thin and gray against the pale sky, watching his shoulders bend to the bellows with the unhurried certainty of a man who had done this work long enough to trust it, and something in her chest loosened slightly, some knot she had not known she was carrying until she felt at ease, and she did not say anything more, only set the bucket down within his reach and went back to the house, before he could see whatever it was that had come into her face. The two axles had been leaning against the fence rail for so long that the wood beneath them had gone soft and gray, the iron itself pitted with rust, in a way that spoke less of hard use than of neglect, of a yard where no one had possessed either the time or the knowledge to see to such things properly. He carried them into the forge one at a time, laid each across the anvil with the care a man might give to setting a broken bone, and stood looking at the bend in the metal for a long while before he ever lifted the hammer, the way he had always done, reading the damage before he tried to answer it. The heat took the iron slow, turning it from black to a dull cherry, and then to a brightness that made the whole shed seem to lean toward it, and he worked the bend out with patient, unhurried blows, no more force than the metal required and no less, until the axle lay straight and true against the flat of the anvil, cooling into a shape it would hold for years. It was on the third evening of this work that Sammy came and stood in the doorway of the forge, not speaking at first, only watching the way the sparks fanned out from the hammer and died before they reached the dirt floor, and after a time he asked how a man knew when the iron was hot enough, and Elias told him plainly, by the color, by the way it moved under the hammer, by the sound it made when it was struck. The boy asked more after that, night after night, standing a little closer each time, and Elias answered every question as though it deserved an answer, never impatient, never as though the asking were foolishness. It was also in those same evenings that he began kneeling by the lame team's stall with a lantern and a bucket of warm water and salt, working his thumbs along the swollen tendon above the hoof, wrapping it fresh each night in clean linen he had asked Martha for without explanation. And though the horse flinched at first, it came in time to stand quiet for him, resting its weight against his shoulder as he worked. Sammy watched this too, crouched at a respectful distance, and one evening he asked, in a voice that had lost its earlier wariness, whether the horse would walk sound again by spring planting, and Elias said he believed it would, if they were patient with it, and the boy nodded slowly, as though filing the answer away someplace it would keep. Cole and Birdsell said nothing of these evenings, not yet, but they had begun to notice how the boy lingered near the forge after supper instead of the bunkhouse, and how he had stopped calling the newcomer nothing at all, and started, without seeming to decide to, calling him by name. There was a night, 2 years gone now but still near enough to touch, when the wind came from a certain quarter and carried the smell of scorched wood from someone's careless burning pile, when he had stood on the porch of the Cedar Hollow boarding house and understood, finally and completely, that the truth was not going to save him. He had gone to the sheriff's office that morning with the same story he had told a dozen times, how he had run into the burning livery not away from it, how the horses had been screaming, and he had gotten 3 of them loose before the roof beam came down close enough to singe the hair from his arms, how he had seen, in the flare of the flame catching the hayloft, the shape of a man he knew running out the side door with a lantern still swinging from his hand. He had given the man's name. He had said it plainly, without heat, the way a man says a fact he expects to be believed because it is true. The sheriff had listened, and had written nothing down, and had told him, not unkindly, that the man in question had left Cedar Hollow 3 days past, packed his wagon in the night, and gone east toward Nebraska, with a woman who was not his wife, and that there was no one left to ask, and no one left to answer for it, and that the town had already settled its mind on who was to blame, because a settled mind was easier to live with than an unsettled one. He had stood on the porch that evening, with his hat in his hands, feeling the specific weight of a judgment that could not be appealed because there was no one left to hear the appeal, and he had understood then that he had a choice that was not really a choice at all. He could stay in Cedar Hollow and spend whatever years remained to him proving a thing to people who had already decided not to need proof, or he could go west with what little he could carry and let the work of his hands speak in a place where no one yet knew what story to believe about him. He had chosen the second, he had told himself, walking to the depot the next morning, with his tools sold and his pockets thin, that a man's hands did not lie, even when a town did, and that somewhere ahead of him there might be ground where that was still true. He had not known then that it would take 2 years and a lame horse's steady weight against his shoulder before he would feel the shape of that belief settle into something like proof. In Larkspur Crossing, the morning came bright and unhurried, the kind of light that made even a working street look briefly generous, and he led the first of the 2 remaining horses out into it with the deliberate patience of a man who had learned that hurry was how mistakes were made in iron and hoof alike. He had built a low anvil stand near the corral fence because the forge itself was still weeks from full strength, and he worked there in the open where anyone passing on the road into town could see him bent over a lifted hoof, paring away ragged frog and old nail holes with a knife he kept honed to a thinness that made the work look almost gentle. He set each shoe by eye before he ever touched fire to it, checking the angle against the horse's own leg rather than against some fixed notion of how a shoe ought to sit, and when he finally nailed it home, the animal stood square and easy, its weight settled in a way that made the difference visible even to someone who knew nothing of horses. It was Cole who first said, low and without meaning to be overheard, that the sorrel gelding was walking straighter than it had walked in a year, and it was Birdsall who answered, just as low, that Grim had been shoeing that horse crooked since before the widow's husband died, and nobody had thought to say so aloud. Word of that kind traveled the way water found the low places in a dry season, without needing to be pushed, and by the second horse a small knot of onlookers had gathered along the fence rail, men who had business elsewhere but found reasons to stand and watch a stranger work. Grim heard of it before the sun was fully overhead, the way a man always hears the thing he least wants to hear, carried to him by someone who thought they were only passing along news. He said nothing to the man who told him, only set down the tongs he had been holding and looked for a long moment at the cold half of his own forge, and something in his face closed the way a door closes when a wind finally finds it. He had built his trade in this town on being the only choice available, and a man who worked cleaner, quieter, and truer than he did was not a rival to be outworked so much as a fact to be denied, and Grim was already turning over in his mind the shape a denial might take, the way a man turns over a stone to see what crawls beneath it before deciding whether to lift it further. The denial came 3 days later, on a morning when the street still held the cool edge of night in its shadows, and the first wagons of the day were only beginning to creak past the depot, and it came the way such things always came in a town like this. Loud, sudden, and aimed to draw a crowd before the accused could gather breath to answer. The smith stood in the middle of the road, with his apron still on, and his voice raised high enough to carry past the mercantile, past the boarding house, past the ears of every man who had nothing better to do than stop and watch another man's ruin unfold in daylight. He said the words plainly, the way a man says something he has rehearsed until it feels like truth in his mouth. That iron stock had gone missing from the depot supplier's ledger, that nails by the keg had vanished without a name attached to their purchase, and that there was only one stranger new enough to this town to have done such a thing, and clever enough to have covered his tracks in doing it. The blacksmith did not raise his own voice to meet it. He set down the hammer he had been carrying, wiped his hands slowly on the cloth at his belt, and reached instead into the pocket of his coat, where a small ledger had ridden for weeks, folded soft at its corners, and beside it a fold of paper receipts stamped with the depot supplier's own hand. He did not thrust them forward or speak of injustice. He only opened the ledger to the street's own light, and began, without hurry, to read aloud the dates and the weights and the prices. Each entry matched in turn to a receipt he laid flat against his palm for any man near enough to see. The crowd's murmuring thinned as the list went on, the way noise always thins when it runs up against something too plain to argue with, and by the time he reached the last entry, a small purchase of wrought iron bought not 2 weeks past, signed for in his own careful hand, the street had gone nearly silent. The widow had come to stand beside him sometime in the reading, though no one could have said exactly when, and she did not speak a single word in his defense, did not raise her chin toward the smith, or offer the town a speech it might repeat over supper tables that night. She only stood, arms loose at her sides, her composure settled over her like a coat worn many winters, and let her presence beside him say what needed saying, that she had seen his work, kept his hours, watched him count every nail before it left her yard, and required no further proof than what already stood folded in his hand. The smith's mouth opened once more and then did not, and the street, watching them both, began slowly to turn its attention elsewhere, the way a fire dies down once it has nothing left to catch. The season turned the way seasons do in that high country, without ceremony, one morning simply colder than the one before it, the light coming thinner through the harness room window, and the water in the trough wearing a skin of ice that had to be broken before the horses would drink. He noticed the cold first in his hands, in the old ache that had lived in the scarred palm since the fire in Cedar Hollow, a dull complaint that came with weather the way some men's joints complained before rain, and he took to wrapping that hand in a strip of wool before he lit the forge each morning, not because the fire itself gave him pause anymore, but because the cold found every old wound and asked it to speak. The yard had changed in ways too quiet to name all at once. The axles held. The team stood sound in their traces, ribs no longer counting themselves beneath the hide, and Cole had taken to nodding at him in the mornings instead of looking past him, and Birdsell had stopped saying drifter altogether, though he had never said when he stopped, and Sammy asked him questions now about tempering steel the way a boy asks a man he has decided to trust. And in the house, in the low kitchen with its smell of wood smoke and coffee grounds, the widow had begun setting 2 plates each evening before he had washed the forge soot from his hands, before he had even crossed the yard from the harness room to the door, so that by the time he knocked, for he still knocked, some habit of humility he could not quite let go of, the table was already laid, the bread already cut, as though his place there had stopped being a question sometime without either of them marking the day. "You don't have to knock," she told him one evening, not unkindly, setting the coffee down between them. "Old habit," he said. "Then it's time for a new one," she answered, and went back to her plate as though she had not just handed him something larger than the words themselves. He ate slower those evenings, aware of the lamp between them, of the way the cold outside made the kitchen feel smaller and warmer by comparison, of how the yard beyond the window had stopped feeling like a place he was passing through and had begun, without his quite deciding it, to feel like a place he might be staying, if she would have him stay, if the 2 plates set out each night were not merely habit, but something closer to an answer she had not yet asked the question for. The night the question finally came was no different from a dozen before it, save that the wind had turned hard out of the north and brought with it the first true bite of winter, so that the windows fogged at their edges and the fire in the stove worked harder than it had all season. He had banked the forge before coming in. The coals settled to a low orange breathing beneath their ash, and the walk across the yard had chilled him enough that the kitchen's warmth struck him like something offered rather than merely found. She had set the 2 plates as she always did now, without ceremony, without the old formality of asking, and he had taken his place across from her with the ease of a man who had stopped counting how many suppers had passed this way. They ate in the kind of quiet that no longer needed filling. It was only after the plates were nearly empty, after she had poured the last of the coffee and sat holding the cup more for its warmth than its taste, that she spoke, and her voice carried none of the weight the words themselves would come to hold. "I've been thinking on the ledgers," she said, "on what a hand's wage covers, and what it doesn't." He waited, as he had learned to wait with her, understanding that she arrived at truths by her own road and would not be hurried onto it. "I don't want a hired man come spring," she said. "I want a partner in the yard, someone whose name sits beside mine on the paper, not below it." She looked at him then, plain and unadorned as she had been from the first night on the boardwalk. "I'm asking if that's a thing you'd consider." The wind pressed against the glass, and the stove ticked as it cooled, and he thought of Cedar Hollow, of the fire that had taken his name before he ever had the chance to defend it, of the long road west that had asked nothing of him but survival. He thought, too, of the forge now standing whole in her yard, of the axles straightened, of the horses shod and sound, of 2 plates set out each evening without his asking. It seemed to him, sitting there, that he had been rebuilding toward this without knowing it, not merely her forge, but some steadier place for himself within it. "I'd consider it," he said, "if you're certain it's a partner you want, and not a debt repaid." "I'm certain," she said, and there was no hesitation in it. "Then yes," he answered. I'll stay." Outside, the coals in the forge held their quiet warmth against the dark, waiting for morning, waiting for the two of them together.